A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this morning for the Distinguished Speaker Series organized by the Institute of Innovation and Entrepreneurship of SMU. We're also very glad that Professor Desai, our director, is here with us today. Every year, IIE invites global exemplars in innovation and entrepreneurship to share their experiences with the SMU community and the public. This November, we are very honored to have Dr. Tim Jones with us today. Dr. Jones is a recognized expert in innovation, growth, and futures. He is the author and editor of 8 books and a regular speaker on innovation leadership, growth platforms, and future trends. For over 25 years, he has worked with many leading multinationals, governments, and universities identifying emerging opportunities. He is a leader in collaborative programs and has made his name in helping organizations to see the world through a different lens and so reveal new areas for potential growth. Dr. Jones is also program director of the Future Agenda, the world's largest open foresight program, and he leads the annual Innovation Leaders Analysis that profiles the companies making the most of their innovation investments. And he is also the co-founder of a global expert network, the Growth Agenda. He is based in Oxfordshire, but travels worldwide. And Dr. Jones has a PhD in innovation performance and 3 master's degrees from Cambridge, Imperial College, and the Royal College of Art. He is a highly regarded speaker for public and corporate events. So Dr. Jones today will provide an overview of some of the key global insights from the Future Agenda project to provoke, challenge, and provide catalysts for new ideas for all. Without further ado, please put your hands together to welcome Dr. Jones.
Thank you to Desai and Chris for the invitation to be here. It's lovely to be able to share some perspectives. What I wanted to do really was just to do 3 things. First of all, explain a little bit of context about what it is that we're trying to do and where these insights come from. Secondly, just to give you a sample of some of the things that around the world people are talking about. And then maybe if we have time, we can have a little bit of discussion at the end about your reaction in different contexts. The first thing to say really is this is a project which we did, I'll explain in a little bit more detail, but we did 5 years ago and we're just finishing for this year. So we've done 110, 111 workshops since February in 40 odd countries. And the whole purpose of this is to try and understand what everybody thinks about the future, because nobody knows the answer. There is no one person you can go to and say, what's the answer? And arguably, it's impossible to predict the future. So what this is all about is trying to anticipate it better. And our view is if you can talk to as many informed people on as many topics around the world, maybe we can start to make some connections. And hopefully, if we give all that information back to everybody, then we can probably make a few more intelligent decisions and maybe a few more big innovation bets, etc. So the context is that this is an open foresight program, so effectively it's taking what people see as sort of a more collaborative open innovation upstream into the foresight. And we tend to look at a 10-year time frame. So we're looking at at the moment we're looking at 2025. 5 years ago, we were looking at 2020, and the context of that is it's far enough away that maybe there's significant change, but it's not so far away that we're into the realms of science fiction, etc. And this was the cover from the book that came out of last time, and although Canadians and Australians get slightly annoyed when I put this map up, the purpose is just to sort of say there's different ways of looking at the world, and this is just one very simple way, and this is the world if you resized every country by its population. So for me, it's just sort of saying all the countries are still in the same place, but maybe where the people are in the future is going to be more influential as to which countries are going to be more significant. And my personal take on this is everybody gets very excited about China, but just look at the size of India in the context of population. So why we're doing this is the perspective that lots of different changes are increasingly migrating from one sector to another, whether it's technology-based, whether it's social, whether it's consumer-based. And if we want to look ahead in one area, let's say food or energy or cities, we have to understand what's happening in other areas. There's no point in having a conversation about food unless we have a conversation about water. And we're having a conversation about water, we've got to have a conversation about cities, and if we have a conversation about cities, we've got to have a conversation about energy, because they're all interrelated. So the intention here is just to sort of take that bigger picture and say, what does everybody think about the next 10 years in all their different areas, in all the different continents, and then can we bring all that together? So last time we ran quite a lot of discussions, 50 discussions, 25 locations, and brought all those together and shared that openly. And for the past 5 years, lots of different organizations, whether it's universities, governments, big companies, small companies, have been using those insights to help challenge their thinking, maybe identify some opportunities for innovation, and maybe start to think about what are some of the consequences of going forward. This time, as I said, we've scaled it up. We've basically doubled the number of interactions, done a whole lot more online, and rather than just having one host, which was Vodafone last time, this time it's been far more collaborative. We've had big companies like Nokia, MasterCard, Intercontinental Hotels involved, but we've also had loads of universities from Ecuador to Stanford to Queensland and Hong Kong, everybody been collaborating on the basis that if we all host an event and get access to everybody's views, then hopefully we'll get that synergy for collaboration. And lots of different topics. As I said, everything's connected. So basically each topic has been discussed on each continent. So we made sure that for example, if you take something like education, we started with a point of view that was written by Sugata Mitra, who you may know from, he did a very, very famous TED talk a couple of years ago, and hole-in-the-wall experiment in Mumbai. But we took his perspective to Hong Kong, and then Hong Kong added their views, and then we took the Hong Kong view to South America, and they added in their views, and then to South Africa, and then to Europe, and then to the United States, and then to Dubai, and then eventually back to India. So by the time we'd gone all the way around, we'd got not just what everybody agreed about, but also what's different in each area, etc. So we're just at the point of trying to make sense of everything. We've got about 800 different perspectives on what's going to be important in the next 10 years. And we sort of brought all that down to around about 80 key things that are in 8 areas. And all I'm going to do is give you a couple of samples from each of these buckets. The last one, changing business, is probably going to be the closest, but I thought if we start off by just sort of looking at some of the other ones and then come back to the business context, that may provoke some thoughts as we go. And the first one, the 5 certainties, as I said, it's very difficult to predict the future. Most of it's guesswork, and we're just trying to be a little bit more intelligent with the guesswork. But there are some things around the world which pretty much everybody agrees with, and here's just a couple. So the issue about population, nobody's particularly concerned about more people on the planet. It's more a question of the fact that the population is getting increasingly imbalanced. And that's an imbalance not just due to age, but also due to location. Are the babies being born in the places which can actually support population growth? Are the countries who are aging getting enough people in to balance their societies? So you see whether it's Japan, Europe, who need more people to keep their demographic pyramid in perfect shape. India pretty much has the perfect pyramid, and parts of Africa are still growing quite significantly. For me, the positive that keeps on coming through about this is just how much healthcare has improved to show how we're living longer. And the fact that a baby born this year will live 6 months longer than a baby born last year just shows you the speed at which we're adding longevity, which can only be a good thing. Clearly, some people are concerned about how that shifts, but as a sort of as a positive direction, as long as we can create the food, provide the space, then lots of people are relatively enthusiastic about this. From a sort of geopolitics perspective, everybody's seeing that McKinsey did a very good map about 6 months ago, which was sort of showing the center of gravity economically over the world, and how it's sort of it sat pretty much in the middle of the Middle East for around about 200 or 300 years, and then temporarily moved across to Europe, and now it's moving back. And the economists view that the number one and number two economies in the world for the past 1,000 years have been India and China, and we just had a temporary blip where the US and Europe had a little bit of influence. And so it's all coming back this way. So that's something, again, that everybody is saying, well, the world's just rebalancing to where it really should be. So no surprises there. And then very much perspective from a technology point of view, that after years of hype, after years of sort of hope, if we do look out 10 years, pretty much everybody on the planet should be able to be connected. Clearly, the quality of that connection and how you use that connection will change, but pretty much whether you're in the middle of the Sahara, the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you should be able to be connected. So those are three things, none of which should be a surprise because everybody agrees about them. But it's just sort of worth putting them on the table to begin with. Say, everything else we talk about is in the context that these seem to be the direction of travel. Now, as I said, everything does have a very strong interconnection, but there are some things which seem to be really coming to the surface now as issues that we need to deal with that are very much coming out of complex areas. And clearly one which affects, obviously, a big story here, but pretty much impacting most cities worldwide is air quality. And this seems to be, 5 years ago, people weren't particularly talking about air quality. 5 years ago, people were talking about climate change, people were talking about transport solutions, people were talking about the need to change. But it seems that the past 3 or 4 years, air quality seems to have become the issue that people understand and are reacting to. Whether you're in Shanghai, Beijing, where you normally see all the pictures of people with face masks, or whether it's Delhi, Mumbai, out of the top 20 countries for air pollution, 16 of them are in India. But it's a common issue all over, whether you're in the Middle East, whether you're in the States. And it seems to be that air quality may be the issue that actually gets people to change their behavior, because it's so directly linked to health, but it's also linked to energy policy, it's linked to transport, etc. So is air quality going to be the thing that when everybody gets together in Paris next month to start the next round of the climate change discussions, be interesting to see how many countries start using air quality in their messaging, because it seems to be the thing, the sort of the catalyst for change. I said nobody's particularly concerned about our ability to feed more people. The issue there is, can we just stop wasting so much food? In some countries, it's all about the supply chain. So the food that's leaving the farms is just not getting into the shops. And then in other countries, and you could argue Singapore, you could argue Europe, actually the supply chain is incredibly efficient. What's inefficient is our consumption and our behaviors. But fundamentally, we're wasting so much food, we could easily feed another 3 billion people without any need for any more land, any need for any GM crops. It's so simple, and yet people just don't seem to be taking an issue. Yes, it's got lots of complexities underneath it, but as an issue, it's one of those which you think, well, from an innovation point of view, surely we could do something about that in the next 10 years and get that to a better situation. And equally, another one which is so obvious and everybody understands it, but nobody ever does anything about it, is particularly within urban environments, the disconnection that we seem to have about diet and exercise. And the concern is that as it says there, we could very well be spending nearly 5% of global GDP just dealing with the consequences of diabetes, lost work, the cost of what is such a simple thing to avoid that everybody agrees about, but nobody actually seems, other than a few examples like Finland, nobody seems to have done anything about it. So there are three things which are very simple, so air quality, food waste, and obesity. Everybody's sort of saying, yeah, if we don't solve these, we're really going to have problems. And yet the answers, everybody understands. Whereas if we go into the world of data, sometimes it's a little bit more challenging. One thing that's clear is everybody's grabbing as much data as they can because everybody thinks there's value in it. Not quite sure exactly where the value is, whether a bit of data is worth more to one organization or one person than another. But with the whole big data rush and everybody trying to get access, not necessarily own the data, but get access to the data, pretty much every organization's trying to do it. Clearly, we've got the whole privacy conversations going on one level. But one of the things that came up time and time again, completely independently, were people saying, if we're using all this data, we need to be able to be more transparent about its value. Arguably, and this came up in Dubai, in Mumbai, in California, in Sao Paulo, arguably we need a marketplace for data. Because at the moment, it's largely sort of a bilateral trade. A mobile phone company will sell its data to a transport company, or somebody like Amazon will repackage its data and sell it to other people. So there's bilateral trades going on. And the argument is that maybe we need a stock market for data. But then we have the problem, because a stock market's relatively easy because it's just two-dimensional. An IBM share is worth the same to everybody else. It just changes over time. The problem with the data marketplace is it's got to be three-dimensional, because you've got time, you've got the value to one person, but you've also got the value to another person. So what's interesting for me about this particular issue is everybody's saying it's important. Everybody's saying we need a marketplace because it's all a little bit hidden at the moment. Different big technology companies, different governments are all saying we're going to build a data marketplace, but no one actually knows how to do it. So the whole protocols of, particularly the issue about how to differentiate between the value to one person to another person, and the fact that when you buy a piece of data, you're not actually necessarily owning it, you're just accessing it. So it can be resold and resold. So it's one of those wonderful examples of everybody saying this is really important, we need to head in this direction, certainly in the next 5-10 years. But lots of uncertainty about how on earth this is going to play out and what are the consequences going to be. As I said, the data ownership issue underlies this. And there's lots of cultural differences around the world in whether we care about our data, whether we see that owning our data is something which is just a temporary thing from the last 20, 30 years. And if you go back to when we all lived in a village and everybody knew everything about you, there was no such thing as privacy anyway. Are we just caught in a little bit of a middle-class conversation about privacy that seems to have emanated over the past 20, 30 years, or is it a big issue? You have completely different answers. If you're in Washington talking to the state, talking to the whole load of lawyers with the government or with Facebook, you have one angle. If you're in a village just outside Johannesburg, you have a completely different perspective. But what seems to be the case is that people are now understanding that their data shadow's there. Some people are taking more responsibility over it. But is this actually going to be an issue in 10 years' time, or will we have just blipped through in that context? And then the other thing that came up about data, and lots of excitement about what we can do with it, was who's going to code the ethics. Simple example, driverless cars. Whether it's Google, whether it's Apple, whether it's Tesla, BMW, everybody's saying by 2020, 2025, we're going to have driverless cars. It may be trucks, it may be cars, but that's all going to happen. But the pushback, and we had this in several places, is who's going to code the car to kill the driver, not the pedestrian? Who's going to put in the human reaction that if you're driving along a highway and a schoolgirl on a bicycle comes out in front of you, you're making a conscious decision when you're a driver, and you'll probably drive off the road or something like that. The big question is who's going to make the automated systems have the human values in there? And yes, if you talk to Google and DeepMind, they're busy at it. But one of the things is, the question is, how do we get the ethics into the machines? And that applies not just in the example I just talked about, but also in simple things like insurance and things like that. So lots of things about data, but little elements about how it's going to play forward. The whole thing about inequality clearly keeps on coming up. The gap between the rich and poor keeps on getting bigger and bigger everywhere. As well as talking about the financial side, lots of people saying, well, what are the issues, what are the shifts that are taking place that we can maybe do something about to help reduce inequality? Because we've got some fundamental problems happening, particularly if you're in the Middle East, but also in Southern Europe, getting ready for 50% youth unemployment is a huge social issue. You know, if you're in Spain or Greece at the moment, if you graduate from university, so you've got your degree, it's probably going to be 10 years before you get your first job that's related at all to your qualification, because unemployment is already so high. And when you have 100 million people highly educated but without a job, what sort of social shifts are you going to have? What sort of anxieties are you going to have in that context? So there's a big issue about, effectively, do we need to redesign the idea of what work is? And maybe it's more part-time, maybe it's more shared, that starts to deal with these consequences. And how can we reinvent education? You know, the starting point for the education conversation was, in most parts of the world, we're using an education system designed 300 years ago. We've digitized it, but fundamentally, somebody's still standing there in front of a whole load of people giving them some content. Well, how does that change? And there was an interesting conversation in Mumbai that said, look, if we can have driverless cars, surely we can have teacherless classrooms. And if we have teacherless classrooms, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't probably mean that the teacher is no longer needed. It probably means that the teacher needs to completely change. Because if you can access all the best content from YouTube, from a MOOC, from MIT open sourceware, or Coursera, or lynda.com, or wherever you're getting the content from, then does that change the nature of what teaching is about, to maybe making teachers into coaches or mentors, rather than teachers being the place where you get the content from? So a real opportunity, if we can get everybody connected, we can give everybody the content for free and give everybody the best content. But therefore, what's the role of a university? What's the role of a school in giving people something else? Is it a shift towards the soft skills, or is it more of a reinvention of what education is and how that content is shared and used? So huge interest, pretty much everywhere we go, whether it's the big corporations, governments, NGOs, everybody's trying to improve education for all the obvious reasons, but at the same time people are saying it's an opportunity to reinvent what it is and how it works to make it far more prepared for the 21st century than effectively still delivering the 18th century experience. Shifting to the world we live in and our habitat, massive migration clearly still taking place into an urban environment. You know, it's 2008 when half of us were living in cities. Most people see that by 2030 there'll be 70% of us living in cities. The problem is we're going into those cities far quicker than the cities can necessarily cope with people. Hence, a third of us live in slums, ghettos, townships. So a challenge coming up is, can we change both the model of ownership and access to space in the same way as Uber and Airbnb are changing our attitudes to mobility? Or can we start to design cities to be more flexible and more able to change quicker to accommodate the speed at which everybody is moving into them? On the flip side, are we going to be exploring off-planet living? It's interesting, it's not just sort of China, the US, and Russia who seems to be re-energizing space. There's lots of other countries we visited who said, you know, off the record, we're going to be doing X, Y, Z. 2025 is interesting because that's going to be when NASA do the first manned trip to Mars, although obviously it's a one-way trip. And it's quite interesting to see how many people are enthusiastic to be part of that one-way trip. What is interesting for me is some of the technologies that are being invented for that NASA trip could completely change things here. Everyone always says about, stuff in the space program, but when you talk about surgery and the fact that they're designing robots to work on Mars remotely from here to do surgery if it's required on the people who are going to be there, then that puts telemedicine into a completely different space. So they're not going to take brain surgeons to Mars, but if somebody needs surgery, they're putting the capability in place to actually be able to operate. So the knock-on impacts of what this means, there won't be hundreds of us going, but the fact that we're developing the platforms to allow people to live permanently, then the knock-on impacts are really, really huge. And at the same time, do we need to rethink some of our existing cities? None of our cities were designed to float, but around about 80% of our cities are on the coast. Whether it's Bangkok, whether it's New Orleans, whether it's Mumbai, whether it's New York, factor in the climate change, rise in sea levels, and our cities are going to flood. And if it is New York, which obviously this is a picture of from Hurricane Sandy, who's going to rebuild it next time? Because when we talked to the insurance companies, the big, the Swiss Re's and the Munich Re's, the people who sit behind the whole insurance system, they've turned around to New York and said, you're not insured anymore. We're paying out this time, but next time you're by yourself. If you go to Canada, in Calgary, they had a lot of flooding 2 or 3 years, and 2011, 12, 13, and the government in Alberta have turned around to 100,000 people and said, sorry, we should never have let you build those houses where they are. Here's $100,000, it's a one-off. You can either use it to somehow protect your house, or you can move, and it's a start to something else. And it's interesting how governments are sort of stepping back from that social, what you'd expect the social responsibility to cover people, because we're not designing our cities any differently now than we did in the past. And there are a few exceptions. The example people always give is the Thames Barrier in London, which you've probably seen, the big sort of big gates that come out of the Thames. That was designed in the 60s, and it was designed to go up once a year. That was the design parameter around it. Last year, it went up 17 times, and without it, Trafalgar Square would have been underwater 13 times. Or a third of London would have been underwater, or all the expensive houses that everybody in the world seems to be weirdly buying in London would be unmortgageable because nobody would give you a mortgage because of the flooding liability. So you can do it, but how do you do it at scale? And how do you prepare for resilience? Because the big change for me, 5 years ago, climate change was sort of something that people were maybe, yes, maybe. And now it's pretty much, well, it's clearly happening. When you're in Houston, when you're in Texas, they don't call it climate change, they call it weird weather. But it's still the same issues. How do we redesign our cities and adapt a little bit? And how do we cope with the billion people who are going to move over the next 20, 30, 40 years? You look at what's happening in Europe at the moment with the problem of maybe 1 million people coming from Syria. Talk to the weather forecasting people and say, well, what does 3 degrees mean? And they give you a great big long list. And one of them is 1 billion people moving north, coming out of South America, Africa, India. There's only one direction of travel. And how do we cope with 1 billion people on the move is a completely different issue than if 10,000 people crossing a border into Germany. So I know some of these are probably sound quite negative, but these are sort of some of the challenges that people are saying, let's be more open about it. Let's talk openly about this challenge and not pretend that it's not going on, because we need to get ready for what the consequences of what's going to happen. Flipping into a slightly more social side, we did quite a lot of conversations on the future of faith, future of religion, future of identity. And one of the ones that really sort of came through time and time again is how now, because some of us are lucky enough to be geographically dispersed, whether it's the Lebanese diaspora, the Indian diaspora, the Irish diaspora, we're all over the place. And it's interesting as to how our identity seems to be changing quite quickly. If you go back 10, 15 years, people could probably describe themselves with 2 adjectives. You may be an Italian American, you may be a Malaysian Manchester United fan, or more likely a Malaysian Liverpool fan. You could probably cover off key elements with two. Now we've got 6, 7, 8 different elements of our identity. It's all mixed together. Somebody used the phrase cocktail identity. So the ingredients have become so mixed together you can't take them apart anymore. And for me, what's quite interesting is how national identity is going down the list. You used to use your nationality or your race as your primary source of identification. And now you may well use your Facebook network higher up. And people are now choosing religion. You know, you've got 65 million Catholics in China who weren't Catholics 30 years ago. So people have said, oh, I quite like that religion, I'll adopt that one. So again, people are not necessarily living a life that they were naturally born into. And from a social point of view, it just means we've got a fantastic opportunity, but it also means that identity is maybe something that people are going to play around with. And going back to the aging perspective, while some countries tend to think aging is a big problem, some countries are concerned about the fact that lots of people will have to work until they're 70, 75, because the system's not designed for you to live for 30 years after you stop working. But the positive side is trying to take hold of some of the pockets around the world where aging is seen in such a positive light. If you're healthier, if an 80-year-old in 10 years' time has the same health characteristics of a 50-year-old 20 years ago, then doesn't that just give us a fantastic opportunity to be more productive, to keep active, and to not necessarily see the end of work, but to see that there's many, many different layers. So different parts of the world. America's very positive about it. Europe tends to be a little bit negative about it. China, clearly from the legacy of the one-child policy, is quite concerned about elements of this. Go to Nigeria and nobody is worried at all. But it's interesting as to sort of how aging is now becoming a positive. How do we change society to better design and think in this way rather than in others? And at the same time, and I know it's been talked about for years and years and years, but at the same time, it does seem to be that the next decade may be where the greater influence of women in some particular countries is going to really start to shift. Yes, there's parts of the world you go to where we're still 1,000 years behind other places, but generally the whole focus on female education has had a huge impact in Africa. It's having a huge impact elsewhere, and there does seem to be a shift, not just on the sort of, not just on the government leadership, but also in terms of women in more leadership positions and how that's starting to change the nature of how we think about the world. So a huge positive enthusiasm around that. And then just a couple on power and influence, which is largely just a sort of, everywhere you go, everyone's got a different opinion about what the States is doing, what China's doing, what about India, etc. And so people say, well, what's the collective summary? And say, well, it's different, it's not only different in every country, it's different in every conversation in every country. But if you take all those conversations together, what is it that people are saying? Generally, people are saying that look out 10, 20 years, and it's going to be India and Turkey that are going to be increasingly influential. Certainly Europe is having major problems, whether it's from the end of the Euro experiment, whether it's from trying to reinvent itself. Certainly Russia, from a population point of view, the population of Russia is declining by 20% over the next 30 years. The uncertain bit about is China's growth going to carry on. So there's this sort of shift taking place, but the big concern is, but what about the Americans? And that's largely because they control the dollar and everything's priced in dollars. So what the Americans choose to do with their currency has such a knock-on impact on everybody else that hence there's a lot of enthusiasm, stroke concern that can we have an alternative to the dollar because the euro is no longer credible. Where is the other global reserve currency going to come from? And is it China? Will the IMF let the renminbi become part of the equation anytime soon? And therefore, maybe will that shift? But that's sort of some of the issues that people are starting to play around with. The other thing that everybody is saying is we should be paying more attention to Africa as a growth opportunity. Some people are very dismissive that Africa is all about resource, it's not about anything else. Very dismissive about corruption, very dismissive about the problems. But when you look at the demographics, that's where the people are going to be. You're going to have 1.6 billion people in Africa in 20 years' time. You're going to have another 500 million consumers. And a lot of African countries are becoming very proactive. If you look at weird things like, if you look at, obviously, mobile payments is really big in Kenya, etc. But if you go to Nigeria, the way that they're using Facebook as part of with the banks to get financial inclusion is phenomenal. They're using social networks to get people into the banking system like you would never see elsewhere in the world because there's this great potential opportunity. So Africa as a growth area, but probably not Africa, all of it. Probably there's half a dozen countries which will take a lead and then other people will follow through. And then the other one that's coming up, and it's interesting, people are starting to rethink why it is that we have companies. When lots of organizations were founded, particularly if you go back to 200-300 years ago, the Cadburys, the Barclays, the Tatas, they had a huge social purpose. And what some people seem to be concerned about is that lots of particularly Western companies are now being run solely for the purpose of shareholder value. So it's all about delivering cash and not about delivering social benefit. And there's a lot of debate going on in many parts of the world as to, from a legal point of view, but also from a political point of view, can we start to rethink how companies operate? And there's a whole thing around integrated reporting that's coming through that's saying, let's stop just looking at the numbers. There's other stuff that's far more important. Yes, you need a healthy company financially, but that shouldn't be why you run a company. And that's coming up quite strongly in many places. And then lastly, if I bring it into the sort of the world of, maybe the world that we live in on a day-to-day basis, what's all this mean from a business point of view? What are people saying about work going forward? What are they saying about organizations? One thing is the speed at which we can get to big is getting shorter and shorter. If you think about something like the time taken to get to 500 million customers. If you look at the car, that took about 120 years before 500 million people had a car. Mobile phone took about 25 years. Tablets took 7 years. Facebook took 5 years. Angry Birds took 3 months. We're in this world where we can get to big incredibly quickly, and we can get to big without actually having to scale as an organization. You can move from being a startup to an SME to a global organization with 100 million customers in a matter of months. So that takes away a lot of the traditional views about the complexities of scaling an organization, because it is increasingly possible. And because business models seem to be evolving very quickly, the ability to reach your target market far quicker if you've got the right proposition seems to be something that lots of people are very excited about. I was in a conversation in Mumbai with somebody from Reliance who are launching a new mobile internet company next month, so I think December the 15th. And I was saying to them, so what are your ambitions? You effectively, this is a new entrant into a mature market. What are your ambitions? And they said, it's all very clear. We're going to have 100 million customers within 100 days. You say, are you sure? Absolutely. So his huge confidence as well that people can get to scale really quickly. So I think that what this is, does that question as to whether we have big companies, whether we have small companies, or whether it's all about reach and access. The whole issue about money keeps on coming up. Are we going to move to a cashless society? Probably not anytime soon, probably 100 years out maybe. We need cash. The black economy needs cash. People want to operate independent of the system. So if they didn't use cash, they'd use something else, and it might be apples, it might be gold, it might be something else. But is there a purely digital future? Probably not. But digital money is going to be increasingly influential. And what a lot of people are excited about, and obviously blockchain and what's sitting underneath Bitcoin, etc., how's that going to play out in terms of allowing you to reinvent what currency is? You know, one example that people gave is if Amazon start having credits, if Amazon credits or Amazon coins exist, and an Amazon credit is worth the same in Australia as it is in Singapore, as it is in New York, as it is in Lagos, then have we just solved the problem of currency fluctuation? If credit is a credit is a credit, and it's got enough scale, do we get rid of the whole currency problem? People then push back and say, yes, but where will that credit sit? To which Amazon's reaction is normally probably in one of our servers, probably in an offshore account somewhere, so don't worry about tax. But also, what does it do to the banks? Well, there is no need for you're not going to pay for transactions on an Amazon credit. So you can see a whole chunk of where the banks make money disappearing because there is a trusted, at-scale alternative currency which enough people in the world are using. And it may be that it's not an Amazon credit, it could be an Apple thing, it could be a Facebook thing, it could be a Bitcoin thing, it could be something that we haven't heard of yet. But the principle is there that money will exist in terms of real cash, money will exist in terms of currencies influenced by governments, but there's a whole other bucket of digital money that's going to exist to do what money was meant to do, which is purely about replacing bartering, really, and a store of value, and without the connection to everybody else. And then lastly, what's a future organization look like? Do we have employees? Do we have the traditional view that we seem to have developed over the past 100 years of what an organization needs to be? The words that people keep on using are all along the top. Flatter, project-based, collaborative, virtual, informal. And when you're talking to a startup or you're talking to a consultancy that's already a global virtual network, people are really relaxed about that. But when you talk to a big organization, a big car company or a big manufacturing company, or you say, so give us some examples because we don't get it. We can see how this might work in the internet world, but we don't see how it happens in the real world. And the two examples that I think people hang on to is one, Microsoft, which although, I mean, it's not particularly a sophisticated, super advanced company, but compared to others, it's still pretty sophisticated. But if you go to Seattle, if you go to Microsoft's headquarters, 120, 130,000 people working there, only about 50,000 of them work for Microsoft. The rest are all freelancers. So they're just coming in and out on a project-by-project basis. So therefore, they don't have an employee relationship with Microsoft. It's far more of a temporary project-based thing. So that's one example. And then the other example that far more people get is to say, well, let's look at the movie industry. The movie industry used to have everybody employed by a studio. Universal Studios or Warner Brothers Studios would employ everybody. Now, probably 4, 5 people on a movie are actually employed by the studio. Everybody else is freelance. Ridley Scott, Brad Pitt, Angela Jolie, the costume designers, the camera crew. You look at if you go and see the new James Bond film this week, look at the credits at the bottom. There's about 4,000 people involved in making that movie. Only 3 of them work for the studio. Everybody else is a freelance. And that industry works perfectly like that. A whole load of people come together for 6 months, do the project, disappear. They may come back together, but not the same people to do the next movie. They go off, and it's a 6-9 month cycle of project, then another project, then another project. And so maybe as we sit and think about what our future what our future graduates are going to be working in, the environment you should think about is more that freelance movie studio thing rather than the sort of standard view. So anyway, as I said, that's just it's a one-year project, lots of conversations, 800 different insights. That's just a sample of some of the things that people are talking about. As I said right at the beginning, they're not all going to happen. They're not all going to be true. All I wanted to show you was some things that somewhere in the world, a lot of people are saying, I think this is important. And just to share it with you so that maybe it might provoke you to think, well, if somebody else thinks it's important, what does it mean for us? What does it mean? What are the consequences? So thank you for that. Anybody got any questions? Any challenges?
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. Now, can I invite Mr. George Han, our Senior Manager of IIE, on stage to facilitate the Q&A?
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the session. I think it was really thought-provoking. We will be ready to take some questions from the floor, but let me just set some basic ground rules. Do identify yourself and tell us where you're from. And do keep your questions concise because we want to optimize the time and allow maximum participation from the audience, right? Can I have the first question, please? Yes, sir.
Adam Lyle, I guess maybe if you had to pick one of them, which would be the one that you think is most likely to have the biggest impact?
So can I go for two?
Sure.
I think the food one is so obvious. It's such an issue. You know, we've run out of space to grow food, so let's just do something about the food waste. It's a no-brainer. I think the digital marketplace is one if it happens, the potential underneath that is massive. You can probably see the nascent elements of that, but whenever people put me on the spot and ask me that question, they're the two that come up. It's sort of like, as an obvious one, just somebody fix it because the food thing needs to be fixed, but the digital one, there's an intellectual challenge for quite a few people.
Thank you, team. Next question.
Legend. Dr. Yu from Inequality. How do you see Singapore in 25 years?
There's a question.
That's very concise. Thank you, sir.
There's a question. So I'm going to sort of circuit that, but I am going to answer your question. So my job isn't necessarily to give my opinion. My job is to give everybody else's opinion back. Pretty much everywhere, Singapore is still seen as the star example of how you can get things right. I was in Dubai last week, and they're continuously sort of saying, so what is Singapore doing? What is Singapore doing? I think generally from an economic point of view, lots of people still see what's going on here as leading edge. The concerns probably are around how big Singapore gets population-wise, and what's the appropriate size of society. You know, in Australia, there's this whole conversation about little Australia and big Australia. And when you go underneath, you say, well, what does little Australia mean and what does big Australia mean? The answer is little Australia is 22 million people and big Australia is 28 million people. And you put that into a global context, and well, that's a bit weird, but you understand from a resource. But the pushback is we haven't got enough water, we haven't got enough. Yes, we're only one of the 4 countries in the world that export food, but Australia has a limitation. And so I just wonder is that given the size of Singapore, is there a limitation on population size, but clearly from an economic point of view, pretty much everywhere, whether we're in a business school in Quito in Ecuador, the question was, so what can we learn from Singapore? What is there that, so very much positive in that context.
I think as a Singaporean, very encouraging to hear that. Thank you. Next question.
Sir? Yeah, hi. My name is Satish. I run a company called Insights. Question is,
first of all, fantastic trends, but they all seem to be linearly extrapolated from what is and what could be. What about something that comes, that right flanks you and blows this out of the park, which is man-made? So to sort of rephrase what that would mean in terms of a question, what if a dirty bomb got in the hands of a terrorist and blew this world order apart? Why wouldn't that be a viable trend or something that you need to sort of factor for?
Okay, so two things about that. First of all, the ones that I chose today to share with were ones that are things that people are in several parts of the world all saying the same thing. So sort of multiple data points, so presumably it has credibility, and ones where you can see a pathway there. We had quite a few conversations and events around on not just future privacy but future of security. We had conversations about the future of terrorism, etc. The unexpected things are unexpected to us, but they're not necessarily unexpected to people who are busy protecting things. But just sort of controversially, quite a few people were saying we will have the first airline disaster due to hacking in the next 5 years. We will have, whether it's state-sponsored or whether it's disaffected kids in a garage turning off the energy supply to a city. That sort of thing is going to be happening because that's the sort of thing which, from a security point of view, they stopped happening 50,000 times last year. The question is, can the guys stopping it keep on stopping it? Or is somebody going to break through? So yes, we have got, I didn't include them, because it's public talk, I didn't necessarily include some of the more controversial stuff, but there's a lot of disruptions that people are talking about, but the reason why I shared the ones today is because you can see there's a signal happening, there's evidence today, there is a direction, so what are the consequences, etc. Is that okay? Okay.
Thank you.
In that line of thought,
sorry, the lady. Okay, I'll let you have it first.
So in that line of thought, my name is Hairul, I'm from the VC industry. From a change management point of view, a few case studies, Uber, right? So a lot of folks in the developing countries are not happy with Uber, especially taxi drivers. Recently, I think this week in Indonesia, Gojek, which is like the Uber for Gojek in Jakarta, the anti-HQ, somebody sort of like threw a screwdriver. Initially, they thought it was a bullet, right? So there are these kind of things where disruptors are getting affected, or there are certain issues, right, within the entire value chain that's affecting, or that's, a lot of people are unhappy with some of these disruptors. So from a change management point of view, how do we address something like this? So how are we gonna, help to ease up, right, some of this disruption that's happening, and not so much affect too much, right?
Okay.
Those people in the entire value chain. So that's my first question. If you allow me, my second question is, the big data marketplace was quite interesting. How do you think that will happen? Like, will it be like a
so the disruption side and the data marketplace.
Because the key thing about data right now is the visualization, right? So it's always contextualized to whatever it is that you need. But when you have a marketplace where you sort of like modularize this entire data, so how do you, from a user case, how do you see that happening?
So disruption and how does the data marketplace work? The disruption thing, I think for me, it's almost become expected that disruption will happen, and therefore most companies are now starting to say, not just how will we be disrupted, but how can we disrupt what's the environment around us. So the complacency that used to exist has disappeared from many of the big companies and also quite a lot of the big governments. And whether it is Uber, whether it is Airbnb, whatever example, people are no longer saying, oh, what's happened to the music industry isn't going to happen to us. They're seeing stuff happening and they're getting ready and saying, how do we either anticipate it or how do we proactively do something about it? So the number of organizations that have got disruptive scanning going on and basically a reinvention of what GE used to do with destroy your own business is fundamentally exploded. On the data marketplace, as I said, lots of people saying it's going to happen, but nobody really understands the how and the why. There's the whole issue, as you said, as to, is it the data that's valuable, is it the insight that's valuable, is it about access, is it about ownership? There's lots and lots of complexities. So my opinion about the data marketplace is there's enough people interested in it, it's probably going to happen in some way or another. But there's so many questions about it that the manifestation is currently quite unclear.
Right, thank you. Later you can interact with Ting, right? Thanks, sir. I think there's a question from a lady, madam.
Okay, hi, I'm Alicia, so I'm a student in SMU. So the interesting thing that I noticed was that the ASEAN, impact is actually noticeably absent in your discussion, in your lecture. And because like yesterday, I went to a symposium wherein the former ASEAN secretary was talking about how the ASEAN region is the next big thing. We're gonna have we're gonna have roughly around half the world's population in the region. We have rising people, more people who will have the education to support the world, and all these, and ASEAN integration is coming up in a few months. So why is it like noticeably absent in your lecture?
So,
Thank you.
Sorry if I missed out on bits, but so that first bit about the centre of gravity, economic centre of gravity moving back, is very much driven by what the whole Asian economic influence perspective. I think the two things that I mentioned that might be relevant to that is this whole issue of whether things can move from being priced in dollars to being priced in an alternative currency, whether that's an Asian monetary unit, whether it's the renminbi, is what everybody's talking about. But does that mean that economically we don't need to trade through the US? Because at the moment, every time one country trades with another country, at some point the money has to go through a US clearing bank. And so there's lots of Asian countries who are very keen on an alternative way to trade that doesn't involve going either through the dollar or through a US bank. And then I think from the next 5-10 years, everybody is quite clearly focused on that this is where all the growth is. The interesting thing about the India and Africa perspective is what comes next. So it's what's happening in the Asian, Southeast Asia particularly, is almost like, well, that's today, and that's probably the next 5-10 years, and that's probably the next 20-30 years of growth here, but who else is going to come on alongside that and become at a global level, if that makes sense?
I saw a hand here, madam.
Yeah, so loyalty was an interesting one because that was initially started very much from a marketing consumer perspective. The first few conversations we had were all about brand loyalty, etc., and people saying, well, certainly things like points and all that is not going to happen in the future. So what's the changing nature of loyalty? For me, what became interesting is that conversation split into three completely different avenues. There was a conversation about loyalty of employees and employers and the organization, which goes to that final slide about do we work for organizations or do we work for on projects, and therefore is our loyalty to the people of the project rather than the employer. There was another thing about loyalty and society and communities and the increasing flexibility of some communities that came out of that. And then the last one really was the loyalty in religion, because people, and we had two interesting conversations, one actually here and one in Kuala Lumpur, on faith and religion and loyalty, and what is it about sports clubs that engender a completely different type of loyalty than you have to Coca-Cola or you have to a bank or whatever, but also how from a religious perspective, going back to that bit I mentioned about increasingly people choosing religion as well as choosing other elements of their identity. How's that changing? So what started, the marketing conversation basically ended up saying it's all going to change, it's all going to be 10 seconds of attention, it's going to be increasingly fickle, you're going to, just like what's happened with, arguably with Volkswagen, you can lose your loyalty by making one stupid mistake. That's going to be the same. What was interesting was, but how is loyalty around the brand, and therefore loyalty to society, loyalty to identity, and loyalty to communities changing. So all that, I forgot to say, from all the conversations, all the insights are on the Future Gender website. So if you want to look at, well, what did everybody say about loyalty? What did everybody say about data? What did everybody say about cities? If you click through onto the top, it says where it says insights. That'll take you into every conversation, and there's about 800 insights there, and you can obviously access them vertically by conversation, but you can also search through them as well, and they're all on Flickr and SlideShare. So it's, if you want to go into more depth, it's all there.
Thank you. The lady.
Hello. I'm now an exchange student from Germany, and I have a question about the movement from the south to the north. You said that we'll have lots of immigration to the north, and yet we hear that the economic shift is going to go to the east. How do you think that also the immigration will go more to the east, and how does this cocktail of identity play into that?
Oh, what a multiple layered question. So the argument given by, if you're talking about the climate change perspective, the argument there is that in the past, migration has largely been due to economic reasons or conflict. And people either move for a better life because they want to be in a city or they want to avoid a war. And the argument is that we're going to start to see mass movement of people because of climate, whether it's drought, flooding, etc. And that is going to override all the other arguments. Because if you've got flooding, if you've got drought, you will move to where the space is, which is generally Canada and Russia, is where there's loads of space. So there's that dimension going on. Economic migration is clearly another layer, but that's more controlled to a certain context. That's why you have visas, that's why you have everything that's in place. So nation to nation migration towards where the power is, you'll see more people coming this way, but it won't necessarily be the same. It's a different type of migration to what's happening from a climate point of view. And then to your identity perspective, you end up with such a cocktail that the whole nature of where you're from ceases to become as influential. And for me, I mentioned it before, but I think Canada is quite an interesting country in this whole space, where Canada is probably the most progressive country for migration anywhere. If you go to the Canadian government website, it basically says, we want more people, this is who we want. If you've got these skills, if you can work in this space, come on over. And we want another 20, 30 million people. And they're being very, very clever, but very, very open about saying, come here. And when you're here, you're part of the mix. It's a mosaic. We don't care where you're from, as long as you buy into the values that are Canada. So you have very negative conversations about migration in lots of countries, largely born out of fear and largely born out of protectionism. Go and have the conversation in Canada, and it's a completely different conversation.
Thank you. Maybe we can have one last question from the gentleman.
Simon from the Center of Innovation for Electronics. You mentioned the New World Order and Turkey. How do you see this particular geography featuring this new order among several of the other?
Okay. So the question about Turkey. So if I go back 5 years ago, we were having people were mentioning Turkey and saying, well, is Turkey going to be Europe's China? So that was a conversation in Delhi where people with the Bank of India, who were saying, is Turkey Europe's China? So sort of put that into context. From a number of people, the speed with which the economy is growing, 80 million people increasingly trading with Europe but not let into Europe was 5 years ago was seen as an interesting possibility. In the conversations that we've had, not just 5 years ago, but over the past 5 years and then this year in Istanbul, there seems to be a question of, should Turkey be looking west, or should Turkey be looking south, or should Turkey be looking north? Due to the geographic location, it's got the freedom to do all of them. The current uncertainty seems to be about whether Germany and France will stop their 20-year negative attitude to Turkey joining Europe. You know, to be quite simple, if you want 80 million people, which is what Europe needs to keep its society balanced, you can get that quite easily by letting Turkey join the European Union. But there's a lot of pushback against that. But the whole thing that's going on at the moment is confusing things. The recent last weekend's re-election tends to put people back onto the perspective that Turkey will not have the uncertainty around its military perspective. Its influence is getting bigger. What Turkey's influence means in terms of Iraq, Syria, what it means in terms of Ukraine, lots of people are speculating. But fundamentally, if you take all that to a big picture, Turkey has always been in a really important location. It's still a massive trading route. It's very trading influenced. It is largely, maybe alongside Malaysia, the most progressive Muslim nation. And it has so many connections economically, militarily, politically, that's why people are saying, although it doesn't have the scale of China, the scale of India, given what it is, where it is, and the size it is in proportion to its neighbours, it's definitely a country to watch. And personally speaking, every time you go to, I've been to Istanbul about 12 times in the past 5 years, and every time you go, and it's, my goodness, it's the same sort of experience as when you go to Shanghai. And it's moved on. It's, the same thing you get in Shanghai, the same thing you get in Dubai. Every time you go, there's another huge tower. There's yet more progress. That's what you see in Istanbul all the time. Now I know Istanbul isn't Turkey, but as a window on what's the potential, it's an interesting signal.
Thank you for the intriguing question to round up our session today. I think let's give a round of applause to our distinguished speaker. I'll hand the mic back to the MC. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before we end this session, may I invite Professor Desai, our Director of IIE, to present a token of appreciation to Dr. Jones. With that, thank you very much, everybody, for being here with us at our Distinguished Speaker Series. Before we leave, may we please request that you fill in the comment card and pass it to the IIE staff, the ladies seated in front, and there's a lunch reception outside, so please enjoy.